And we're on the air. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal once again with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Miles Smith. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Greetings, everybody. Welcome to this first lecture in our comparison of Nietzsche and Socrates, inspired in good measure by Allan Bloom to start with. My name is Miles Smith. I'm the co-founder of the Petrarch Institute, and we're delighted to have you with us, whether you join us for this lecture or for the full course.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. So I mean, we're basically going to incorporate this into the course. Most of the other lectures will be audio podcasts, I should say. But maybe I should start a little bit about how the idea of the course sort of started. No.
I think it's good to get a sense of how we got where we are.
Yeah. So I mean, Allan Bloom made some very interesting comments, both in various interviews and in his most famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, which was published in the late 1980s, about how Socrates and Plato, Socrates and Nietzsche are really, in a way, these we could say fundamental alternatives, to use a phrase that his teacher Strauss used. So I mean, he basically talks about in The Closing of the American Mind how this discourse of values has become very central, right? So Socrates basically views the problem of ethics as a problem of knowledge, right? So it's basically the idea that there is a good that exists objectively, right? And the task of philosophy is to find it, and indeed that is the most important task of life. And what Bloom says is that there has been kind of a revolution that started off in very rarefied circles, right, of intellectuals and so forth, but now has become common knowledge, right? And he writes, this new language is that of value relativism, and it constitutes a change in our view of things, moral and political, as great as the one that took place when Christianity replaced Greek and Roman paganism, right? He sees this as something completely revolutionary that has taken hold. And this is this idea in Nietzsche of moving beyond good and evil, to take the title of one of his books, right? Instead of thinking about ethics in terms of good and evil, we start to think about it in terms of values. And the example he uses was Reagan's, you know, he calls the, in one of his famous speeches, calls the Russians the evil empire, and it created a big storm at the time. And why was that? Well, part of it is, right, if he had said, well, our values are different from those of the Soviet Union, it probably, as Bloom suggests, that did not and would not create the same sort of reaction, right? Because somehow values are viewed as relative. But when you start using the language of good and evil, which is, of course, the language of our central religious traditions or central monotheistic traditions, and the language of the classical tradition of philosophy, which has always been the quest for the supreme good, you use that language, it seems to create this reaction. So I thought it was kind of interesting to look at that contrast between these two ways of looking at ethics. And Miles's dad suggested, you know, that would be kind of an interesting course, and I thought of it, and so here we are.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us, and as we get started on this lecture in which we contrast these two polar figures, there's obviously a great invitation to look at what separates them, and ultimately, towards the end, some of the things that unites them once we've looked at both of them. But with Bloom, and in general, when you're looking at Nietzsche, what you're looking at is a figure who confronted some of the contradictions and tensions in the maturing modern age. Would you agree with that, Alex? Does that open the door for us in terms of how we might understand Nietzsche as a polar figure?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find interesting about Nietzsche is that on the one hand, he seems a very odd fit for our contemporary age, right? He seems a very odd fit in the sense that he was one of the most iconoclastic temperaments in the history of the Western tradition, And if you look at our time, let's say the last century and a half or so, right? I mean, one of those central values that we've had is this value of equality, right? And Nietzsche is dead set, again, I mean, deeply critical of this value of equality. I mean, our time has seen the expansion of democracies everywhere, right? This transition from traditional aristocratic culture to democracies. Nietzsche has no time whatsoever for democracy, right? Deeply critical. Socialism, which is another type of egalitarian ethos, he calls the tyranny of the least and the dumbest, right? Which he says arises from the, quote, the tepid air of democratic well-being, unquote. A deep critic of the whole concept of women's emancipation, which of course has been one of the most characteristic things about the modern age. He attacks mass culture, middle-class values, Christianity, of course, which he sees as ultimately the force behind egalitarian ethics, nationalism, and the state, which he calls the coldest of cold monsters, right? So basically, that pretty well covers the bases of virtually the entire spectrum of modern developments. So in one sense, he's a very iconoclastic figure. But in another sense, I would argue that he speaks to our time in some ways much better than he spoke to his own time. In some ways was a prophetic figure. Maybe I should outline some of those, no? So if you look at the 19th century when Nietzsche was writing, right, it has been called by modern historians the Age of Optimism, right? It's been called the Age of Optimism. What was the 19th century about? Why did they feel this optimism? Well, I took a look at Palmer and Colton's book, The History of the Modern World, right, about this late 19th century mood, which is the period Nietzsche was writing. And what they wrote is that, quote, people ate and dressed more adequately, slept in softer beds, had more satisfactory sanitary facilities, right? The waters were filled with ocean liners. Railroads were rising up, right? By the end of the period, electric lights, right? They believed that their civilization, the European civilization, had come upon scientific knowledge which had replaced primitive superstition. But it was not only in material terms that European civilization felt the supreme self-confidence, but also in moral terms. Isaac Taylor, who was a British historian, wrote a book called Ultimate Civilization, right? Which was, in many ways, a good iconic word for the period they felt that they were coming to, right? And he talks about what are the relics of barbarism: polygamy, legalized prostitution, capricious divorce, sanguinary and immoral games, infliction of torture, caste, and slavery. Very interestingly, virtually all of these things were being abolished in the course of the 19th century, right? The abolitionist movement and so forth. So Europe tended to call itself at that time the civilized world, right? And this had both a moral and a material sense. Now, what is interesting about Nietzsche is he believes that underneath this veneer of civilization are these sort of dark, violent, and chaotic forces that are just underneath the surface and that are shortly going to bubble up, right? So he writes that. Nietzsche writes in his preface to The Will to Power, he says that what I relate is the history of the next 2 centuries. I describe what is coming, what can no longer come differently, the advent of nihilism. For some time now, our whole European culture has been moving as toward a catastrophe, with a tortured tension that is growing from decade to decade, restlessly, violently, headlong, like a river that wants to reach the end, that no longer reflects, that is afraid to reflect, right? Those words probably made little sense in that very optimistic self-perception of the late 19th century Europe. But after World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, the implosion of Western civilization, the first half of the 20th century, people began turning to Nietzsche in a very strong way. So I think that that would be one element. Another thing is he lived in a time which still talked about itself very much as a Christian civilization, very common term. And to the degree that atheism had appeared, right, in the late 18th and 19th century, it was often of a very optimistic kind of atheism, right? The idea that we, or at least secularism, right? The idea that people were breaking free from superstitions and things which had tyrannized over the human mind as they saw it. But for Nietzsche, right, they're not really thinking through the real consequences of Nietzsche because of nihilism, because the real consequences of atheism, because the values that had guided Western civilization for centuries sort of hinged on Christianity. And now that that was being undermined, he thought that there would be a sense of loss, right? So how does so in The Will to Power he writes, what does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. The aim is lacking. Why finds no answer. Radical nihilism is the conviction of an absolute untenability of existence when it comes to the highest values one recognizes, plus the realization that we lack the least right to posit a beyond or an in itself of things that might be called divine or morality incarnate. So he very much, I mean, part of, actually his critique of the things that I was talking about, socialism and democracy and all these things, he felt that they very much rested on a kind of Christian ethos that believed in the absolute dignity of all human beings and assisting the downtrodden and all this sort of thing. But they now were without foundation, right? And they somehow wished to continue Christian ethics or revised versions of Christian ethics, but without the Christian religious belief, right? So and this mood of meaninglessness, absurdity, right? Obviously, if you look at existentialism, right? Camus, who says the only important philosophical question is suicide, right? This mood of how does one make one's way in a life filled with suffering and absurdity and without God, right? I mean, this sort of pessimistic atheism, I think, draws back to these sort of questions of existential angst that were raised by Nietzsche in such a potent way. So those would be some of the themes, and maybe I should talk a little bit about the values discourse and that sort of thing, because it probably ties in, right? That makes sense?
Absolutely. I mean, at this point, there's a kind of segue to be made, because you've got a thundering philosopher, a little bit like a prophet, who decries much of what he sees. He's gone around, as you say, machine gunning sacred cows and foretelling dire things. And so then the question, in part, is why does he come to be such an influence on a relatively cheerful 20th century, especially in the American setting from which Bloom observes?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, that's sort of the kind of funny thing that I was talking about, right? I mean, so Bloom sees a lot of this. I mean, so he writes, and this is sort of, a response to sort of the Socratic approach. He writes, the respectable and accessible nobility of man is to be found not in the quest for or discovery of the good life. That would be the Socratic quest, right? The quest for the good life, it's important to say, right? But in creating one's own lifestyle, of which there is not just one, but many possible, none comparable to another. He who has a lifestyle is in competition with and hence inferior to no one. And because he has one, he can command his own esteem and that of others, right? So this language of lifestyle is another one that Bloom thinks is very Nietzschean, right? I mean, when one removes the question of good and evil, right, one removes issues like judgment, like moral reform. I mean, there's a whole constellation, penitence. There's a whole constellation of concepts. And we now tend to judge, and this is very Nietzschean, right? We now tend to judge the quality of a person's morality by their commitment to their own code or their creativity, right, in producing their own code, rather than in its correspondence to anything like objective morality, right? And so that's one thing. And obviously, value relativism can also be a tool, right, to seek to undermine forms of discourse that one dislikes. So I think that that is kind of a quite interesting thing. This, I think, expresses the key point in which this from Bloom's text expresses, I think, the key point in terms of the contrast with Socrates. So he writes in the closing of The American Mind, values are not discovered by reason, and it is fruitless to seek them, to find the truth or the good life. The quest begun by Odysseus and continued over 3 millennia has come to an end with the observation that there is nothing to seek. The alleged fact was announced by Nietzsche just over a century ago when he said, God is dead. Good and evil now for the first time appear as values, of which there have been 1,001, none rationally or objectively preferable to any other. The salutary illusion about the existence of good and evil has been definitively dispelled. For Nietzsche, this was an unparalleled catastrophe. It meant the decomposition of culture and the loss of human aspiration. The Socratic examined life was no longer possible or desirable. It was itself unexamined, and if there was any possibility of a human life in the future, it must begin from a naive capacity to live an unexamined life, right? So this is completely overturning the Socratic approach by saying, well, essentially there was nothing to seek, right? There was the Socratic quest for the good life, but apparently there's nothing to seek. Values are projections of human creativity and human commitments, and it seems that in many ways that is still the milieu in which we're in today, right, in terms of a lot of popular thinking about ethics, which only goes to show the widespread influence of Nietzsche. Did you want to, were there any other points you wanted to bring up? Or
just in summary, it sounds in many ways as if something interesting happens to Nietzsche, because on his own terms, as Bloom lays him out, he seems to take exception to Socrates because Socrates robs life of that which gives it its seriousness, which is to say its tragic perspective, and the need for a kind of creative, a radically creative response, a response that in the absence of an underlying ground of truth and reality requires a strong and resolute creative will to project and impose meaning and value.
Yes.
No, go ahead, please.
No, yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think we'll see that when we look at The Birth of Tragedy, which I think is an interesting text because you start to see a lot of Nietzsche's early thought developing. The question is, can human beings, right, can man bear the experience of meaninglessness and suffering, right? And that explains why Nietzsche, through his reading of Greek tragedy, right, I mean, let's say it's the authoritative reading, right? But through his reading of Greek tragedy, it's not just an aesthetic treatise, but also something that becomes his sort of philosophy of life, right? And I think that those issues of existential meaninglessness, despair, right? Those sorts of issues became prominent, right, in the course of the 20th century. So should we turn then to Socrates and take a look at him a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, you know, we just characterized the way Nietzsche sees Socrates, and you know, Bloom talks about the contrast between Cicero describing Socrates as a friend and a contemporary, and Nietzsche describing Socrates as an ancient and an enemy. But of course, you know, from where Bloom sits, Nietzsche has caught on for very different reasons, as you just explained to people in the outline of what a value is and how it works. A part of the appeal is that, unintentionally perhaps, Nietzsche lets everyone off the hook. There's a great deal of exoneration that goes with values rather than truth, because it lets you off the hook in terms of having to comport yourself in relation to truth, to find it, to know it, and to strive to build your character in keeping with something that's absolute and unflinching, so to speak. And interestingly enough, that's a little bit the sort of character, the sort of uncompromising character of a different kind that Socrates is. So perhaps this is a great chance for you to introduce to people Socrates as if he were a friend and a contemporary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those were really good points, and I guess the question that Bloom is going to try to ask is, can this question be raised anew, right? Our age has tended, right? I mean, we now use the language of values, which implies a certain acceptance, perhaps, of some of the Nietzschean framework. But the question is, are the questions raised by Socrates ones that can be raised anew? Now, I think one thing to say about Socrates, one thing that I find impressive when I was reading Guthrie's biography of Socrates was a description of just what a magnetic personality this guy was. And I guess if the irony with Nietzsche was the fact that he basically had contempt for almost every sacred cow of the modern age, and yet was lauded by it. I mean, Socrates, you would not think would be such a charismatic figure. I mean, Guthrie describes him as ugly, flat-nosed, pot-bellied, and pop-eyed man, right? And yet people who actually encountered him in the flesh, you look at Alcibiades. I mean, it found an encounter with Socrates to be a life-changing experience, such as they could no longer live the same way again. He quotes from the Symposium, Alcibiades, right, and how when he encountered Socrates, he says, most of us paid little or no attention to the words of any other speaker, however accomplished. A speech by you, he's talking to Socrates, or even a very indifferent report of what you said stirs us to the depths and casts a spell over us, women and men and boys alike. I myself, gentlemen, were it not that you think me absolutely drunk, would have stated on oath the effect which his words have had on me. Whenever I listen to him, my heart beats faster than if I were in a religious frenzy, and tears run down my face, and I observe that numbers of other people have had the same experience. Nothing of this kind ever used to happen to me when I listened to Pericles, and Pericles, of course, was one of the great rhetor statesmen of Athens, and other good speakers. I recognized that they spoke well, but my soul was not thrown into confusion and dismay by the thought that my life was no better than a slave's, right? So you have this sort of this transformative experience of these people that were pursuing the various things that the world values, power and wealth and these various things. And after an encounter with Socrates, have this what have I been doing, wasting my life this whole time? The only important thing is the quest for the good. I should have realized it was obvious, right? And of course, one of the best examples of that would be Plato himself, who's the principal conduit through which we know of Socrates, which is, he was an aristocrat, really groomed for political power and office. And when he met Socrates, he decided to devote his life entirely to philosophy, which Socrates understood in terms of these concepts like the good, the care of the soul as the most important thing, the cultivation of the virtues, and so forth. And perhaps the greatest testimony, of course, to Socrates' sincerity and devotion to these concepts was the fact that Socrates ultimately gives up his own life, right? And he's offered the opportunity to just keep his mouth closed. Stop bugging people in the agora, Socrates. Trying to figure out whether what they claim to be goods really are goods, right? Whether what they think are the virtues really are virtuous. Just stop it, Socrates, and maybe we'll let you live. And Socrates replies, perhaps someone might say, Socrates, can you not go away from us and live quietly without talking? Now this is the hardest part to make some of you believe, for if I say that such conduct would be disobedience to the God, and that therefore I cannot keep quiet, you will think I am jesting and will not believe me. And if again I should say that to talk every day about virtue, and the other things about which you hear me talking and examining myself and others is the greatest good to man, and that the unexamined life is not worth living, you will believe me still less. So if I can just summarize, right, some of the key aspects of Socrates, right, so it's this idea of the care of the soul, right, the cultivation of the virtues is the highest end, the equation of virtue with knowledge, right, that there is something called knowledge of the good, that this exists, and that while it's not easy to discern, there is nothing more important in life, right? So this is what Strauss calls the zetetic life, the life of inquiry into this, right? Even, Socrates talked about his own knowledge as being the knowledge of ignorance, right? But even the knowledge of ignorance, right, is a step in the right direction on this most important of all quests. So I think perhaps now we can see a little bit of the contrast between the sort of values ethic of Nietzsche, right, which essentially ultimately concludes, perhaps despairingly in some sense, that the quest for the good life is chimerical, right? It's illusory. And Socrates, who's convinced that, as the X-Files logo said, right, the truth is out there. So perhaps that gives something of the contrast.
And it might help people to look at the difference between the two in terms of the importance to them of the historical moment or the cultural frame. Because, on first blush, of course, Nietzsche is a modern, and to the extent that we are still in a modern age, he's closer to us. And Socrates is an ancient and is remote. But on the other hand, Socrates, in the way you've just outlined him, is liberated because of, however tortuous it is, the access to the true and the good, in ways that we now call Platonic.
Yeah.
He's liberated from the historical moment and the cultural frame in a way that Nietzsche is not. So when Nietzsche laments that God is dead, he can't possibly mean that an infinite being has expired. What he means is that our culture has drifted to a point where we have lost him, and we are powerless to do better than that. There are all kinds of heroic, individualistic, willful things we can do in the creative vein, but we can't really swim against that tide. Yeah. Whereas Socrates does not seem to believe that, and the sense that I have, and I bring it up because it might be a question in some of our students' mind, does Bloom take sides there? The impression you get is, as seriously as he takes Nietzsche, and as much as he sees Nietzsche as having colored the environment that Bloom finds himself in, it is Socrates he agrees with, because Bloom is famous for saying that the real community is those who are seeking the truth, those who are would-be knowers, and so that seems to put him more in Socrates' camp.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche's importance for Bloom is more as a diagnostician of our age. But I was mentioning before we started this cast, right? His teacher, Leo Strauss, I believe he remarked that, like, the big epiphany was in his life was at the moment that he realized, well, Plato might be right, right? In other words, there's nothing about the fact that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates lived in one age and we live in other, which necessitates that our answers are more correct. And certainly all these figures, Bloom and Strauss and many other figures, I would put in that category people like Pope Benedict, right, who talked about the importance of turning to the Greeks in his Regensburg address. All these people are putting before us are the answers that our time has come up with necessarily the correct ones. Of course, the Greek prejudice would have been that the truth is in some way eternal and therefore always accessible in every age. But it's interesting that that Strauss, and I suspect Bloom would agree, talked about, well, what are the obstacles to the recovery of the let's say, at least not necessarily the classical answers, at least the classical approach, right? They're basically twofold. One is Socrates talks about knowledge of the good, right, as being what he's in search of. But in our time, there's a tendency towards scientific positivism to believe, well, knowledge really only exists in the realm of the physical sciences, right? You can have knowledge about the boiling point of water, but how do you have knowledge about whether cannibalism is right or wrong, right? So there's, I guess, the fact-value distinction. And the other one is what you were sort of alluding to, which is historicism, which was particularly strong perhaps in continental Europe and those that were influenced by the German tradition that Nietzsche would have been very involved in, which is this idea that all values and all concepts are historically grounded in such a way that nobody can really escape the presuppositions of this time, nor can we judge other epochs and other concepts by our standards, right? So there's a kind of relativism that passes by way of history, and a kind of relativism that passes by way of science. And those are some of, I mean, these are obviously huge issues. We just talked about two gigantic domains of knowledge, science and history. But these are obviously the kind of problems that we need to think about in thinking about, the recovery of the ancients and their approaches to ethics and the good and the virtues and these things, and why we seem to have difficulty with that in our time.
One thing that might be worth considering briefly towards the close, Alex, is taking Bloom and Socrates and Nietzsche together. So, I mean, we've outlined a number of ways in which they might seem to be polar opposites, and certainly that's the sort of educational scheme that Bloom draws up. But of course, like the North Pole and the South Pole, the diametrically opposite places have some things in common. They're both places of pivot. They're remote at the ends of the sphere, and there's a kind of polar fraternity there, perhaps. You get a little bit of a sense in the way that Bloom frames it that Nietzsche, being the first philosopher vehemently to attack Socrates, in some ways resuscitates him, because through the kind of evolving modern confident philosophy that Nietzsche attacks, Socrates would still have been held up as a kind of revered figure, but in some ways as a mummified figure, perhaps, or as a relic. But in attacking him and in addressing the question of the seriousness of life and the serious undertaking of grounding your life in something singular and worthwhile, Nietzsche seems to have a kind of outsider brotherhood with Socrates in some ways, you might say.
Yeah, in fact, the first text we're going to read is The Birth of Tragedy, and in sections 11 through 15, where he focuses on Socrates and Euripides, I think you will see the mixture of just incredible admiration for Socrates combined with, it's very much an attraction-repugnance relationship that Nietzsche has with Socrates. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a couple of things to mention there. The first thing is that Nietzsche, unlike many modern philosophers, was a classicist, right? And he shared in 19th century Germany's just veneration of the Greeks as sort of setting the standard of culture, which means he was completely immersed in Greek culture. Now, the picture that he wants to draw of ancient Greece is not the usual one, and we'll get into that more with The Birth of Tragedy, right? I mean, people like Winckelmann and Goethe and Schiller kind of thought of the Greeks as being these sort of timeless models of eternal beauty, sort of above the passions and representing this sort of thing, and he's going to be focusing on this darker element, these darker destructive elements that he sees in the Greek culture. But that's the first thing, is that Nietzsche is mentally in the same world as Socrates in the sense of he's projecting himself. He's trying to immerse himself in this world of Greek culture. Another thing, as you alluded to, is that both of them are dealing with really the same set of problems, right? I mean, there are many sort of scientific philosophers in the 19th, 20th centuries who have very little concern for fundamental problems like meaning and values, and is it possible to find a good life, right? And all the, what are the limits and capacities of our reason, right? They're dealing with really fundamental problems, right? And just as Aristotle says that all opposites depend on commonality, right? For example, black and white are both colors. Or maybe I should have said red and green, because some people say black's not a color. But the point is that there is this shared set of problems, which I think makes it a course worth having in terms of setting them side by side and looking at the alternatives. So and both of them, I think we could say, were characters. I mean, I think both of those figures have just inspired. Of course, Socrates has had more time, but they both inspired this. I find it, teaching them in class, they both inspired this kind of wondrous fascination at their personalities and at the way in which they come across in the text. Nietzsche writing in his own pen, and of course Socrates we generally encounter through Plato, his student. So I think on those three grounds there's a lot in common. But I don't know, maybe I should just say a little bit about the arc of the course, just very briefly.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we've got to a point at which, both of these figures are outsiders, are iconoclasts. They're both in some ways martyred figures at odds with their time, and they really contribute their energy and their ideas outside the academy, and yet they've become incredibly seminal to the academic environment of the day. So thanks to Bloom and the way he sets them against each other, we're able to see both of them as being as relevant as any of our contemporaries. That's maybe a good starting point to help give people who are interested in joining the course a sense of what we're going to do in the lectures ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, basically what I thought was because Birth of Tragedy is where, which is one of Nietzsche's very early works, was it, I think, 1872 or something like that? I mean, it was when he was still quite young, and it's really his first significant foray into philosophical, published philosophical writing. Is also the first place where this critique of Socrates emerges. And his own contrast to the Socratic philosophy, which is the tragic philosophy, which he associates with the god Dionysus. So we'll take three full lectures, lecture topics to deal with the birth of tragedy and cover the whole thing. One of the reasons for that is because a lot of his later writings, which are in many ways what you think of as the core of his corpus, don't have the same kind of single coherent line of argument that runs through the whole thing. They're sort of more aphoristic in many cases. So we'll pick and choose with the later works, but I thought with Birth of Tragedy, and because it kind of grounds his thought, we'll start there. And among the other texts of Nietzsche that we'll take a look at would be Beyond Good and Evil, which is, of course, that phrase that Bloom refers to, right, where Nietzsche kind of wants to go in the study of ethics. The Will to Power, which deals with European nihilism, and its sister topic from the Gay Science. And I should, where he writes The Madman, who proclaims the death of God, right? So these two topics of the death of God and nihilism, which have become so commented on in the course of the 20th century and in our time, we'll deal with that. And some sections from Twilight of the Idols as well, which also deals, right, he has a whole section called The Problem of Socrates. So that is as far as Nietzsche. As far as Socrates, I chose basically three texts. One is the Meno, which elucidates the whole problem of virtue and knowledge, and whether virtue can be taught, whether virtue is a form of knowledge, and so forth. So we see this big concern of Socrates emerging there. Then the Gorgias, right, which I think is a very interesting text. Its putative focus is rhetoric, right, and the contention of rhetoric and philosophy. But the real deep theme there is truth and appearance with respect to the good, right? So you have this category in philosophy, which had already existed in natural philosophy, of how do we distinguish truth, the true nature of things, from appearance? And this becomes precisely the distinction that Socrates will bring up. And I think we would see there a contrast, right? The assumption that there is a distinction to be made between truth and appearance in ethics, right, will run against a lot of this modern discourse in ethics. And then finally, I couldn't leave us without the Apology, which is where Socrates stands trial for his life and basically gives the justification of the philosophical life lived in quest for virtue and the good. So there's the arc.
It sounds like one heck of a ride, and I think for this opening lecture we've given our students quite a lot to chew on, so that sets us on our way, I think. Is there anything you want to say in closing, Alex?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess what I should say is how to contact me. So alex.rosenthal at petrarch-institute.com, or just go to our website, at the Petrarch Institute, and go to the contact page if you're interested at all in our courses. I look forward to you, and I hope that the topics we discussed today stirred up some interest. And you probably want to mention Twitter as well, Miles.
Absolutely. Beyond that, you can also preview a lot of our material and join conversation with us at Petrarch Center, CENTRE, on Twitter. We look forward to seeing you in all those venues.
Excellent. Take care, everyone.
Till next time.
Bye-bye.